All right, good evening, everyone. I appreciate everyone coming out. My name is Mark McBride. I'm Assistant Chief of the Wildlife and Forestry Division here at TWRA. I'm going to introduce a few other folks that are going to be speaking tonight. We've got Dr. Garrett Clevenger. He's our Deer Program Coordinator. Roger Shields is our Turkey Program Coordinator. And we're here tonight to talk about a new deer and turkey management process that we have with the agency. And a large part of that is going to be getting input from the public. We want to get broad input into what we're doing so that we know your values are considered through this process. So I appreciate you all coming tonight. I know it's a weeknight and you had to deal with Nashville traffic, but thank you. Hopefully you feel this is well worth your time and you can provide some good input. So we'll start with kind of a high level background of what we're doing. Then we'll get more into the details. We'll talk about these draft regulation packages, and this is really where we need your input. We'll talk about new deer and turkey units that we have, and we'll kind of wrap it up by breaking out, moving to tables, and just having discussions about this and getting input from y'all. So for starters, this new process really started back in 2019. Our deer and turkey strategic management plans outlined adopting an adaptive harvest management framework for managing deer and turkeys. And there's kind of been a lot of steps that are involved in this, and we'll go into details about these. This is where we are now. We need your input. But first, I want to talk about the next few steps that we have after we get this input and kind of what the final product of this whole new process is. So once we get all this input, every year we've got annual data that we collect on deer and turkeys. Not only do we have harvest, we also do summer turkey brood surveys where we get an estimate of how many young turkeys or poults are on the ground. We've got some age structure data for deer, which kind of tells us, how many young deer are coming into the deer population. And so we're going to take that annual data in a structured way now and put it into models where we can figure out, hey, given what the population, where the population is and what the population is doing, this is the best regulation package to help us meet objectives that we've identified. And then after we go through that process, this is the recommendation that we'll then bring to our commission. So again, this is mostly an internal process, but we want to bring you all in to help us craft it. And so to help visualize how this is really going to work and what our, the end product of this is, I've got the decision tool that's used for waterfowl management on the screen here. So any of you duck hunters may be familiar with this. Every year this is used to set the duck hunting season. And so you can see on the left column there, we've got mallard breeding population, and across the top, it's the number of May ponds. And depending on the interaction of those two things is how we decide what hunting season is selected. So to kind of draw a parallel with turkeys, we may know what our population is, but we also want to know what it's doing. So if we've got a lot of turkeys on the ground, but the poults per hen for a couple years has been really low, and there's not many young turkeys coming into the population, our decision tool like this is going to say, hey, you may want to be a little more conservative because there hasn't been a lot of turkeys coming into the population. And so we're going to have a tool just like this that gets at that interaction of turkey population and how many birds are coming into that population through time. So we're adapting to the conditions on the ground. So now we're going to go talk about some of the more specific details of how we're going to get to that final product. And the first thing we knew we had to do was we had to delineate biologically based units, because if we're using poults per hen for turkeys or age structure or recruitment for deer, we don't want to be looking at that number statewide. We need to be looking at a smaller scale. We need to be looking at a scale where we think like that poults per hen number is probably pretty similar across that area, because all the biological drivers, the biology on the ground is somewhat equal. So we've created new deer and turkey units that are based on biology that will help us better understand what's happening on the ground every year. We then assembled focus groups. We had these groups get together and really talk about what our goals were for deer and turkey management. We wanted them to say, you know, value wise, what you value as a hunter, what do you want the agency to be managing for? Once we got those objectives set, we had them go through an exercise, and this is where the bulk of our conversation is going to go tonight. We had them go through an exercise where they created regulation packages. And so that's where we are now. If you guys go back to this duck slide, there's all these different colors on here, and those colors just correspond with different hunting packages. So in the top left corner, you can see that red there. It's got a C in it. That stands for closed, because in that situation, if you look at the axes, there's a really low number of breeding mallards, but there's also low habitat. There's a low number of ponds. So the model is kind of saying, well, we need to be real careful here because there's not many mallards and there's very little habitat. If you go all the way over to the right in that table, there may not be many mallards, but there's a lot of habitat on the ground. And so we can then scale up to a different package. So how this works with ducks is the low end is closed, and then we have a restrictive package, which is a 30-day season with a 3 duck bag limit, and there's species restrictions in there. So for example, with mallards, you can only have 1 hen mallard. As conditions improve and you go all the way up to the liberal package, and this is what duck hunters are accustomed to, you have a 60-day 6 duck season, and those species restrictions are more liberal. So you can have 2 hen mallards in the liberal package. But it's important to note here that before all this modeling was done and the waterfowl managers were trying to figure out what was going on the ground, they had to set these packages. These are a specific part of the model that need to be set up front so we can consider the impacts and learn what the impacts of those hunting seasons are based on where the population is and again, what the population is doing. So I've mentioned focus groups a few times now. The focus groups consisted of about 60 different individuals across hunting organization, NGOs, federal government, some state government folks. There was UT extension agents kind of coming from the habitat side. And these folks met a total of 24 times across a deer focus group and a turkey focus group and really dove into deer and turkey management. Again, they started with outlining these objectives that we want to achieve with deer and turkey management. And then they went through this exercise where they looked at all these different population statuses, a low population, but it's growing. There's a lot of recruitment. A high population, but it's declining. There's not many birds or deer coming into the population. And they created these packages, which are really just hunting seasons across that whole range. And so we took all those, we kind of consolidated them down because we need to have distinct packages. They can't be similar. We don't want to have packages that are too close to each other where we're flip-flopping seasons. So we want to have a few set packages that are distinct, that our stakeholders are comfortable with for that given situation. And so tonight we're here to present to you all those packages, the first stab that the focus groups took, and learn from you all what is acceptable to you. Do you like them? Do you not like them? What are we missing? What other input do you have? And so before we get into those, I just want to provide a little context for you guys to think about while we're doing this. You'll probably notice a lot of these packages are pretty similar to our current seasons. What we found with the focus groups is folks really like our hunting seasons now. So we're not proposing any drastic changes. You know, the restricted seasons, which we're not in a restricted scenario, the restricted seasons obviously pull things back a little bit. So don't think about this as, hey, this is the season that we're going to implement. This is just if we ever find ourselves where things are getting tight on the landscape, what is an acceptable hunting season to you there? And when Roger and Garrett present these packages, they'll kind of provide a little bit of that context to help you keep that in the back of your mind. So WMA regulations, right now we have a lot of WMAs that have the same hunting season as statewide. That WMAs that fall under that situation will now just have the same hunting season as their unit. Except we know a lot of WMAs don't follow statewide seasons. They have their own regulations, and that's still going to be the same. We know there's different situations on the ground. There's heritage. Some WMAs have traditions with certain hunts. We're not taking that away. So the WMA process will really stay the same is the message. And so these season packages are also going to stay the same. So once these are set, once we get broad feedback and folks understand kind of this whole process, we're going to set these distinct packages and leave them alone. And we're going to choose from that list depending on what the populations are doing. And so I'm going to bring Roger up. He's going to go ahead and walk through where we are with the turkey packages, and then we'll follow that up with the deer packages. Thank you.
All right, good evening. So just to kind of set the stage a little bit again from where Mark introduced things, the focus groups, when we met, again, they were asked to just consider kind of hypothetically different situations. And this was not an effort to try and identify the most biologically sensible or the best biologically based package or season framework, right? This was a value-based thing. And we just wanted to understand what they felt was acceptable to them. And initially we asked the groups to consider, what's the most restrictive season that for turkey, say, that you can think that the state would ever go to and that hunters would accept. And kind of, we talked about that. And then we went to the other extreme and points along the way, but to the other extreme, what's the most liberal package or hunting framework that you think the state would need to go to that would satisfy hunters? And so that's kind of what we're going to walk through compartment or component by component for the different frameworks. So looking at the bag limits, we talked about what's the most restrictive bag limit that you think hunters would accept in a situation. And focus groups felt like one bird. They didn't want to go unless it was just completely dire and we had to close the season. They still wanted to be able to hunt. So one bird was like the minimum. In a moderate situation or moderate condition, then we could go to 2 birds. And they felt like under a real liberal situation that really 3 birds was sufficient, that would meet most of the hunters' needs and wants, really their values. So that's the range that the focus groups were giving us. And we're just presenting that, kind of want to see if this is in line, right, with what hunters really do think. In terms of the season length, again, looking at what's the most restrictive we could go, the focus group said they didn't really think people would want to go any lower than 3 weeks. They would still want to have some opportunity to hunt, get out in the field. And so the most restrictive season length they recommended would be like 3 weeks. You go to 4 weeks under a moderate situation, and then the most liberal package would maybe have like a 6-week hunting season. That's what we're at now. Hunters seem to like that. And it provides, in their mind, plenty of opportunity. So that was kind of the range of season lengths that the focus groups that we were kind of hearing from them. A couple of other areas we talked with the focus groups about start date. So when should the spring hunting season start? And there's been a lot of discussion about the impact of the season start date. And so we talked a little bit about that. And we were able to share some information from research that we've done through the University of Tennessee, looking at the impact of delayed seasons. And we've learned from that the delay doesn't really have a strong impact on reproductive output. However, we learned some other things from that project. We saw that hunter success did go up. So maybe birds were more responsive to calling during that delayed start. And so hunter success was better, but we also learned that hunters were not hearing as much gobbling. And we know hunters like to hear gobbling when they're out in the spring. So those were kind of 2 different directions we're being pulled. But we also heard kind of anecdotally that delay did provide some better weather conditions for the youth hunt. And so in talking about all this, the focus groups felt like maybe having a start date around the Saturday closest to April 7th would be a good compromise between all of that. That would meet all of those different needs that we talked about. And doing so would put the season starting, it would range from April 4th to April 10th. The other thing about this is by setting it at that date, even under the most liberal package that they talked about, that 6-week season, it would never run into Memorial Day weekend, which was something that the focus groups felt like under our current conditions or current start date and season lengths this year and or last spring and this coming spring, it's going to run into Memorial Day weekend, and they didn't think that was a good idea. So kind of recommending to us that maybe we back it off. So that's what the focus groups were kind of recommending to us as a start date for spring turkey. In terms of the fall season, we heard pretty strongly from the focus groups that if things were really, at a restrictive level, that we should probably just close the season in the fall, not even allow it. But under other conditions, whether we wanted to have a moderate package or the liberal package, there wasn't strong direction one way or the other. This decision as to whether or not to have a fall season is not really a biological question. We don't harvest enough birds in the fall, and it's a gobblers only type season that we don't really impact populations biologically. And so this was really a hunter value thing. What do they value in terms of the fall season? And we had kind of two camps, if you will. We had one group that felt like they liked the opportunity. They just, even if they don't ever harvest a bird or they don't pursue it themselves, they thought it's nice to allow people the opportunity to harvest a bird in the fall. But we had other group that felt like they really value the spring season. They put their focus on maximizing the number of adult males that are out there in the spring so they can have the best spring season that is possible. And so they valued closing the fall season in order to allow more of those birds from the fall to survive into the spring. So we didn't get real strong direction from them. We just want to get more input from the public through this exercise that we're going through here now. Either way, if we were to have a fall season, focus groups, there was strong agreement that what we've got now seems to work well. So there wasn't really any discussion about changing that from their standpoint. They would recommend just basically the same season lengths, start dates, all of that is what we've got now with a one bird, basically one bird per unit limit. The other area that the focus groups were kind of split on was regarding allowing adult hunters to harvest jakes. Again, this isn't really a biological decision. Whether or not you harvest jakes doesn't really impact the population's ability to reproduce and grow. It's more about what do hunters value in terms of their hunting and their preferences. So we were again kind of split. We had a camp that really liked the opportunity that allowing jakes to be harvested by adults affords, whether it's somebody that's new to hunting or if it's just somebody that's struggled that season and it's getting late and their only opportunity to be successful and harvest a bird that year might be to harvest a jake. And so they saw that as, valuable to them. But again, we had that group that really just wanted to protect the jakes, allow them to survive and become 2-year-old birds into the next spring to maximize the spring harvest. Again, we're just trying to get feedback from more groups of hunters and see kind of what the preference is, if you will. Irrespective of what we decided to do with the allowing adults to harvest jakes, there was no discussion about not allowing youth to harvest jakes. Everybody was pretty in agreement that we should allow youth to always harvest jakes. And with that, I'll pause here and turn it over to Garrett to talk about the deer packages.
Well, thank you, Roger, and thank you, Mark, for setting kind of the stage for the deer regs. Hopefully that kind of provides some context for why we're doing this and kind of the concepts between how we've kind of arrived at these certain packages that we're going to talk about. Just a couple things to kind of note before we get started here. Deer are a little bit more on the complex side when we have to think about how we set seasons, especially to understand that we have different weapon seasons that we take into consideration for deer hunting across the state. As well, we have to think about harvest of both sexes as well, understanding that does are the drivers within these populations, and that we want to regulate doe harvest in areas where we're trying to manage the herd differently. Obviously, allowing more liberal seasons in areas that we want to have more intensive management to stabilize or bring down the population to a more biologically appropriate level, or to kind of step off of antlerless harvest in areas when we're trying to grow the population. And just to kind of reiterate the scenarios as we move through these packages, understanding that when the focus groups looked at this, they looked at it from a wide range of different scenarios that we could see through deer populations throughout the state, from one of the big ones being CWD, chronic wasting disease. We have this out in West Tennessee now, and that being a big driver for why we might choose a certain package or another, all the way down to some of the extreme areas out in East Tennessee where deer are very limited by habitat and need to be managed to grow. And so we had a wide range of these that we brought to the focus groups that weighed in on some of these. So I'm going to jump right into it now, and we'll start by talking about some of the things that the focus groups really seemed like they didn't really want to change much. And a lot of this has to do with the basic structure of our youth hunts now, the way that they're structured. And then the August velvet hunt were two things that we really didn't want, or the focus groups found that they really didn't want to see any changes come about. They thought that they were pretty good the way they are. Where they fall, the start date and structure of those seasons. Also, the focus groups really like the way that the disease management initiatives that are in place now are structured in the replacement buck program. If a hunter goes, this is a statewide program where if a hunter harvests CWD positive buck, then they are then allowed to harvest another buck within that same season they harvested that deer, or the following season. That structure, they didn't want to change anything with that. The landowner disease permit program, again, another CWD program that wherever a CWD positive deer is harvested, within a 3-mile radius of that harvest location, landowners can then apply for these permits. And then obviously the Earn a Buck program, which is a CWD management tool where hunters now can harvest for every antlerless deer that they harvest. They're then allowed to harvest an additional antler deer in addition to what's allowed in the statewide bag limit. So some things to get some input on here. What the focus groups came up with for deer hunting start dates, we didn't see a whole lot of change from what they'd brought forth. Obviously, now we have an archery season that starts the 4th Saturday in September. The focus groups thought that was pretty good where it was. The muzzleloader season currently starts the 1st Saturday in November. There was a little bit of thought among the focus groups to have a 1-week muzzleloader season in certain situations where they thought that they wanted to be a little more restrictive in areas to potentially grow the population. Currently, we have a 2-week muzzleloader season, but they thought that a 1-week muzzleloader season might be a good option for some of those areas. And lastly, they thought that the gun season was pretty good the way that it is and where it starts now, the 1st Saturday before Thanksgiving. And again, just to reiterate, there would be, they figured that the youth hunts were pretty good just the way that they are and the way that they're structured. So there'd be, they thought that there should be no change to the structure of the youth hunts. So moving on to season length, again, thinking about the range of different scenarios that the deer population could experience throughout the state. When we think about that restrictive to liberal kind of scale here, and specifically during the gun season when the vast majority of deer in Tennessee are being harvested. The focus groups figured that a restrictive package would look somewhat around 3 to 4 weeks. And then under a moderate or liberal type season, it would be anywhere between 5 and 7 weeks. And we've kind of put an asterisk here for something that hopefully we'll be able to get a lot of input from the public on moving forward was this kind of 5 to 7 week period would depend on whether or not there was a certain split between the gun season. And we'll talk about this in more detail in the next few slides. So buck bag limit, again, understanding similar to what Roger was kind of talking about earlier with the jakes. This is really not a biologically driven variable that we're looking at, understanding that, you know, we can harvest a lot of bucks throughout the state. And it's really not going to really tilt the needle on management. However, when we think about the values of hunters, obviously, this is a big topic that comes into play. And most of the folks in the focus group thought that around $2 was a pretty good place to be at what we are currently under the statewide bag limit of two per hunter. However, some of the focus group members brought up that under a more restrictive scenario, it might be good to go down to $1 to kind of have a more mature age structure in some of those areas and not allow that $2 limit. For antlerless bag limit, obviously, it gets a little more complex here, but hopefully some of these packages should line up with folks that are more familiar with hunting in East Tennessee. Currently, our bag limits for East Tennessee, we allow in all those different zones that are out there, four antlerless deer during the archery season, and then a variation of either 1 or 2 during the muzzleloader season. And then in some of our more extreme situations, such as Unit C and D, we allow harvest of 1 antlerless deer, but under a shortened gun season. So the focus group thought that a shortened gun season in a more restrictive scenario would be good without closing any of the options on potentially having a closed season scenario. Again, this is not something we have in place now, but potentially wanting to move to this at some point in time if we ever had to, of closing antlerless harvest during the gun season is still being an option. Under a moderate package, again, 4 during archery, understanding that not very many hunters at all will ever reach this limit, but still allowing that same kind of season structure to reduce complexity. But increasing the bag limit during the muzzleloader season and the general gun season throughout the full season to 2 apiece during those seasons. And then similar to what we see in Unit L now, a liberal bag limit of 3 per day. Most of the focus groups thought that should just be kept the same to reduce complexity and was a pretty good place to be at. So I talked about this earlier. We're talking about kind of the season start dates and season lengths. And hopefully this is a time that we can hopefully gain some more input from folks on whether or not these might be good ideas, and also to kind of provide some context to how the focus groups arrived at these scenarios. But the gun season split that I mentioned earlier, the focus groups were trying to think about ways that we could potentially increase harvest in areas that we're trying to be more intensively managed. We have to understanding that for CWD management to slow the spread of the disease, really the only tool we have is to increase harvest in those areas. And one of the kind of highlight points of this split that was brought up, or the reasonings behind this, was the focus groups thought that having a split would increase as an additional opening day effect, where when the season would come back in after a set period of time, understanding that a large portion of our harvest occurs on the opening weekend of firearm season, that a second opener would be another big boost to the overall harvest. Another thing was that a lot of the focus group voiced that processor considerations was another limiting factor in them harvesting additional deer. Understanding that processors get clogged up and closed down and aren't able to take any additional deer. So during that break period, they thought that having this could benefit processors and allow them to stay open longer so that those hunters could then be more willing to harvest additional deer because they'd have somewhere to take those deer to. Some negative impacts of this split would obviously be that there would be lost gun days to take into consideration, as it'd be different. We currently have 7 weeks of gun season. So this would be a loss of gun days, potentially in areas that may be closer to the rut for some. So just to kind of lay out how this season structure would look, the first gun season would be 9 days, again, opening that Saturday before Thanksgiving, first Saturday before Thanksgiving, staying open 9 days, closing the following Sunday. And then there'd be a 12-day gun closure where archery would be allowed from Monday through that weekend, then into the following Friday. The gun season would open again on that Saturday or day 13 until the last day of the season, currently like we have now. Some other input that we wanted to garner from what the focus groups came up with were not only the gun season split as I've just described, but also to reduce complexity and provide for lost opportunity. As some may know, in West Tennessee, where we have Unit CWD, the muzzleloader season was converted to a 2-week gun season, an extension to that season that started after the close of archery, in addition to the last week of archery season. But folks wanted to have that. It seemed like folks wanted to have that opportunity to hunt with only a muzzleloader for traditional reasons. So going back to a statewide muzzleloader season was very important to some of the focus groups members. The other thing that we wanted to hopefully gain some input on was that there's been some consideration of a primitive weapon season. Folks that have hunted in Mississippi are fairly similar to this type of season, where a certain portion of the muzzleloader season would potentially be converted into allowing single shot, straight walled metallic cartridges, breech loading guns with an exposed hammer. And then lastly, 2 more things here. Shorter gun seasons was another thing that was really something that stood out with the focus groups. Obviously, for out in West Tennessee, this was become an issue for some in that the gun season now concludes on January 31st. And so there was a 2-week extension that was into place there. And there was a lot of issues with small game hunters. Focus groups thought that this was interfering with those folks that were trying to get out there and hunt. And also another unit CWD thing that arose last season was the commission voted to go from a $2 limit to a $3 limit in unit CWD. And that caused a lot of confusions. The focus groups really found that confusing, and it was important. They found it important to go back to just a single $2 statewide limit to reduce that complexity. So that's essentially what we have here to hopefully get some further input on. So I'll turn it back over to Mark, and he can go over the units.
All right. Thank you, Garrett. So those deer and turkey packages are really what we want to get feedback on tonight. But before we get to that, I do want to talk a little bit more about the units. So as I said earlier, if we're going to be using things like pulse per hen and catch per unit effort or age structure in deer to set our seasons, we don't need to be doing that at statewide, right? We know deer populations behave very different in West Tennessee than they do in East Tennessee. So what we wanted to do was identify the biological drivers on the landscape that influence deer and turkey populations. And we wanted to make those things somewhat equal across these units. So when we're using pulse per hen or age structure, we're considering that at a scale where it's probably somewhat similar across the range where we're making a decision. So the first step was looking at deer. Hey, what do we know? What do we know influences deer populations? What do we have good data for? That was another piece of this. We have to have, solid data that meets statistical thresholds to use that data to identify these units. So just looking there, a few things that pop out, I think that most hunters can really resonate with. Percent agriculture, obviously harvest, buck and doe harvest. We know that's important to populations. Percent agriculture, public land, even mean elevation can have an impact when you look from West Tennessee to East Tennessee. So we did this essentially the same thing for turkeys, where we looked at all these different variables that influence turkey populations. Percent ag again, percent open pasture. We know that's really important to turkeys. And so the idea was to go through this modeling process where we maximize the similarity across all those variables in an area, and at the same time maximize the difference outside of those areas. So an easy way of understanding that, again, is just that we wanted these units to kind of reflect similar deer turkey population behavior, so that when we're using poults per hen or age structure, whatever it is, that should be somewhat equal across that landscape. Now, we know we can never create a unit in the state where things are equal across it. We could not even manage a county where turkey populations or deer populations are doing the same thing across that county. You could have two different neighbors who are having vastly different experiences. So when creating these units, it was kind of trying to strike the balance between, they need to be large enough to reduce complexity so we don't have a lot of units across the state. They need to be large enough so that we've got the data necessary to make these decisions, but also small enough that we can detect meaningful change on the landscape. We want to find that balance where, hey, we know what's going on, but it's not infinitely complex where we got all these different units and different things going on and changing. So these management units, we're calling them deer management units, turkey management units. These are going to stay the same over time. We need them to stay the same for data collection and understanding the impacts that our hunting seasons have on the populations. The management units are the hunting units. So this whole harvest management process that I talked about at the beginning and all that data, that's going to be collected and analyzed at the unit scale, and we're going to set the season at the unit scale. That being said, units may and many likely will have the same hunting season. So for instance, now we currently have 6 different deer hunting units, and we have 6 different hunting seasons in those units. And I'll show the deer map here in a second. We're proposing going to 6 slightly different deer units, but we probably won't have 6 different deer hunting seasons. And turkeys, there's 5 turkey units. We could have 1 turkey season for the entire state, or maybe 2. So just because there's a set number of units doesn't mean every single unit has to have a different season. So these are the deer management units you can see here. There's 6 units. And again, the management units are the hunting units. Here's the turkey units. We've got a handout. We'll hand out and we'll talk about these more. Again, the turkey management units are the hunting units. And so I just want to thank you guys again for attending. If you didn't get a chance to sign in at the front, please do give us your email address. We'll send out more summaries. We're also going to have a link available where you can go online and it'll walk you through every single one of these packages we discussed today, where you can provide input in that form as well. But at this point, we're gonna break up. We're gonna sit down. We'll talk with you guys, answer questions, go through input, and really, you guys let us know what you're thinking after hearing that, and we can put stuff back up and go through it. So with that, thank you guys.